Well, hello, everyone. This is our last class with Professor Gilberto Lima on wage inequality as a source of endogenous macroeconomic fluctuations. Gilberto is a full professor at the University of São Paulo. He holds a PhD degree in economics from the University of Notre Dame and a master's degree in economics from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. His main research focuses on economic development, innovation, technological change, and economic growth. He has published books, chapters, and papers in many important journals in his research field, such as Cambridge Journal of Economics, Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, Review of Keynesian Economics, and so on. Giba, we have suggested to the other professors to give a lecture first, using up to 1 hour, more or less, and then we open the floor for questions, but feel free if you prefer to have them during your lecture. Thank you very much, Giba, for your contribution to this school. It's a really great pleasure to have you here. Please, the floor or the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Carol. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what part of the world you are now. Let me start by thanking Carol and the other organizers for kindly inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me congratulate them for this school, which is I think it's a very nice opportunity for us to be able to interact in these turbulent times. But let me, as for the questions, you should feel free to raise any question at any time. I will be sharing my screen with you, so I may not be able to see you while I will be speaking. So I will ask Carolina if there is some problem with my connection, she can give me a call. I don't use a cell phone usually, as some of you know, but in order to avoid some problem, I have this cell phone here, so Carolina can call me if I have some connection problem. So let me, I will be sharing my screen. And the idea, I gave 3 papers for you to take a look first, hopefully, if you had the time or if you had the opportunity to do so. I will focus my presentation in one of them because they have a common ground to some extent, or there are in some sense variations on the same theme. So I will be focusing my presentation in one of them, and then in the end, I will talk a little bit about the other 2. Let me share my screen with you. I hope you can see it.
Yes, we can see, Giba.
Yeah, I can see some of you. So this set of 3 papers, along with some others, is part of a joint work with Jair da Silveira, another Brazilian fellow. And basically, what we do in this set of papers is to apply some tools from the field of evolutionary gains to macroeconomic issues. So the main purpose is to try to better understand some macroeconomic behavior, some macrodynamics of some key variables, using to microfound these models some contributions from the field of evolutionary gains. So let me start with some, let's say, more conceptual issues, which motivates not only this paper, but also this full set of papers that we have been developing. Maybe the most motivating empirical evidence from which we build in order to advance this type of line of work is that we have plenty of empirical and also experimental evidence showing that heterogeneous behavior is the rule. Heterogeneous behavior on several dimensions of several types, but heterogeneity in behavior and in expectations formation is, let's say, there is plenty of empirical evidence for this type of behavior. So what this implies more directly, theoretically speaking, is the inadequacy of any modeling device based on the framework of some representative agent. Moreover, we also have plenty of empirical evidence that decision making is usually occurs under imperfect information and bounded rationality on the part of decision makers. This is another very robust empirical evidence. Moreover, as I will talk about in a while, there is also considerable empirical evidence that heterogeneity in behavior and expectations formation is time varying. It's not parametric, it varies over time, and it varies endogenously. Well, this set of empirical evidence leads us to conceive the possibility of building models, macroeconomic models, incorporating this evidence using the approach of some evolutionary dynamics, especially some evolutionary dynamics coming from population biology, where the idea is to discuss the conditions which lead to the composition of the population to change over time. One of the implications of the current coronavirus crisis is that it has become more popular to talk about issues which come from biology. So we talk a lot about diffusion, we talk a lot about replication, we talk about a lot about mutation, and these are all terms which are common in biology, especially in population biology, especially in evolutionary biology. So here we are going to build a model in which the composition of the population of ferns will change over time in a way that I will describe in a while. This has a broader theoretical implication, I would say, which is a better way of addressing the connection between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Let's say the mainstream view regarding this issue, which is, let's say, the more conventional approach to it, is that macroeconomics has to have sound micro foundations. But of course, the way micro foundations is seen in this approach is in a very narrow way, which means that any macroeconomic conclusion is only valid if derived from some, let's say, optimizing exercise on the part of the individual agents. But here, the use of some of these evolutionary dynamics will allow us to conceive of the interaction between macro and micro in a different way, especially to conceive them as co-evolutionary phenomena, in the sense that microdiversity will be the usual state of affairs, and microdiversity will co-evolve with macrodynamics. This co-evolution means that macrodynamics will participate in the dynamics of microdiversity, and there is also the feedback from the dynamics of microdiversity to the macroeconomic outcomes. That's what I mean by this co-evolution between microdiversity and macrodynamics. And I will try to persuade you that one way, not the only one, and maybe not the best one, but one profitable way, one promising way of dealing with issues regarding wage and earnings inequality is by using this type of evolutionary approach. So, in a nutshell, wage and earnings inequality are wage and earnings inequality. They are, in this kind of approach, a counterpart of microdiversity. So it's a kind of microdiversity. Microdiversity can and will often translate into wage and earnings inequality. But then we take a step further in this connection between microdiversity and macrodynamics, and we will show that wage inequality under reasonable conditions may lead to macroeconomic fluctuations. So in that sense, wage inequality is not only a negative feature per se, but it's also a possible source of macroeconomic fluctuations. So that's the, let's say, the punchline, the main punchline of my presentation is this. We will be able to show, we will be able to build what seems to be a theoretically consistent model showing how wage inequality is persistent, but also that reasonable values or levels of wage inequality may lead under reasonable situation, under a set of reasonable conditions to persistent fluctuations in the macroeconomic variables, or in the main, or in some main macroeconomic variables. Let me finish these initial comments on a more conceptual and methodological level with this methodological plea. And my methodological plea is the following. It's fine if you don't like the model, or if it's also fine if you don't like models at all. But I will try to persuade you that they are useful to some extent as an organizing principle, as a way of, let's say, organizing our thought about some issues. But if you don't like this specific type of model, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Well, it's not always easy to define what's the baby, or who, or let's say, who is the baby and what's the dirty bathwater. But in this case, I think that the bathwater that should be preserved is the methodology, is the evolutionary methodology. So if you don't like the model, be more patient about the methodology. So for this paper in particular, we build on a set of motivating empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence on which we base the building of this model is that there is it's the persistence of wage differentials even after we control for a set of observable individual characteristics. So we have a vast empirical literature showing robustly that even after we control for observables like schooling, human capital, gender, years of experience, and others, even after we control for that, we still find some unexplained wage differentials across workers, across firms, and across even across some establishments within firms. So we have this documented evidence that there are inter and intra-industry wage differentials. They are non-negligible and they are persistent. So this is very robust. In the paper, we provide several references, but they are simply some representative. Let's say it's simply a representative sample of a much larger literature showing that. This is what's sometimes called in the literature firm wage premium, which is the finding that some firms pay higher wages than others for identically skilled workers. Let me emphasize, let me underline this feature of the evidence. These wage differentials are found to be persistent even after we control for observable characteristics. Because we know several observable characteristics. We have stories for that. We have models for that. That's not the purpose of this model. The purpose of this model is to try to explain through some other empirical evidence this type of unexplained wage differential that persists even after controlling for these observables. Now, another set of empirical evidence which is important for our story is that firm heterogeneity in productivity and wage setting power is an explanatory factor underlying these wage differentials. And we have also plenty of evidence for that. So this, let's say, is one set of empirical evidence. The other set of empirical evidence, which is important for us here, is that we have, again, considerable empirical and laboratory evidence showing that higher wages very often incentivize better performance on the job, or that labor productivity varies positively with the wage compensation. Of course, this second set of empirical evidence is not, let's say, a natural law, in the sense that you will not find in the empirical literature evidence on the contrary. I'm not claiming that this is an, let's say, a natural or universal law. These two sets of empirical evidence that I'm using to motivate the exercise, they are robust enough to call our attention. But of course, if we do a search, a Google search, a Google Scholar search right now, we will find other empirical evidence on the contrary. But that's not the point, because we don't have many, if any at all, universal law when it comes to the empirical evidence. What matters for my purposes is that these two sets of empirical evidence are robust enough to be used as a motivating device, let's say, for the building of the model. So what we do using this empirical evidence is to develop an evolutionary microdynamic model having these two features of the labor market, which is persistent wage inequality and the endogeneity of labor effort, and hence endogeneity of productivity to the wage compensation as two interconnected features of the model. So how does this will work on the microeconomic side? On the microeconomic side, we will have firms which will periodically revise and possibly switch their choice of paying workers either with a higher wage or a lower wage. So, in a way that I will describe in a while, firms will periodically revise their decision regarding either to remunerate workers with a higher or lower wage. This means that the productivity of the employed workers will be different depending on whether the firms will pay the higher or lower wage. So average productivity in the system will change over time as firms revise and possibly switch their decision regarding how to remunerate workers. I will describe this in detail soon. When revising their wage compensation strategy, the firms will use a satisficing protocol, an evolutionarily satisficing protocol based on the contribution of Herbert Simon, which won the Nobel Prize in 1978, I think. So this is the micro side of the model. Then we will couple this micro side of the model with the macrodynamics of the system. And the macrodynamics of the system will be described by a demand-led model, by a model in which variables such as the degree of capacity utilization and the output growth rate will be driven by aggregate effective demand. And also another macro variable, which is crucial in this demand-led specification, is the functional distribution between wages and profits, which is another dimension of income inequality. In this model, we have income inequality has two dimensions. We have the functional dimension, which is the distribution between wages and profits, which will be endogenous, which will change over time in this co-evolutionary way with the microdiversity. And also, another dimension of income inequality is wage inequality. So we have inequality between wages and profits, and inequality within wages. So let me give you two spoilers. Spoiler one is the following. We will be able to show under very plausible and theoretically reasonable conditions, wage inequality can be found to be a persistent outcome. So the model delivers a possible explanation for the persistence of wage inequality that we find in the empirical evidence. What this means, formally speaking, is that we will be able to show that wage inequality is a stable long-run outcome. Second spoiler, we will show that plausibly low levels of wage inequality are enough to yield endogenous fluctuations in the macroeconomic variables of interest, which are the functional distribution of income, the degree of productive capacity utilization, and output growth. So this way, we show that we not only replicate the persistent wage inequality that we find in the data, but also that we provide an alternative explanation for the persistence of endogenous macroeconomic fluctuations in a few variables. We don't do an empirical testing of any of these two predictions for reasons which I may go through later, let's say, but mostly because, let's say, in the intellectual division of labor, my co-author and I, we believe that our best contribution is on the theoretical side. But of course, you are more than welcome and invited to implement an empirical testing of these propositions if you think it's worth doing it. Well, for those of you who had a chance to go through the model itself is simple, but the questions that we wanted to address with the model made it very mathematically heavy. So the model, unfortunately, it's heavier than, let's say, it could be. But that's not the model to blame. The model itself is simple, but the kind of questions that we wanted to ask from the model made the solution of the model very complicated. Of course, I will save you these of the hustles of the mathematical passages of the model. I invite you to go through the model. Don't be scared by the appendices. The appendices took us quite a long time to complete, but you can trust it. you can trust the results. So let me make a claim again, pessoal. You should feel free to raise any question, any clarifying question as I go along. So if it's a clarifying question, which is important for the understanding of my presentation, please, you should feel free to do so. You can either, let's say, turn on your mic. You can, let's say, I will not be following all the time what's happening in the chat. So, but Carolina may let me know if you want to raise a question through the chat. But please feel free to interrupt me with any clarifying question as I go along. So the model is simple in the following sense, or one of the senses in which the model is simple is the following. Let me make a parallel in this respect with a typical econometric or a typical presentation of a paper delivering some econometric exercise. So what's one of the most comments? What's one of the most common comments that is raised during a paper delivering some econometric results? One very common question is, what's your identification strategy? Which is a reasonable question to raise for a paper like that. But a related question is the following. Have you control for this? Have you control for that? Have you control for this other possible influence? Have you controlled for other covariates? Because suppose, for instance, that I'm trying to find any causal relationship between, let's say, money, income, and happiness, for instance. Of course, happiness is influenced by a whole set of factors, but I'm trying to test whether for some specific data, happiness is affected by income. Of course, in order to detect in a robust way whether there is a causal relationship coming from income to happiness, I have to control for other factors which typically are found to affect happiness. So here I have a very specific purpose. Can I find through a model any causal relationship between the way firms decide to compensate workers in a context in which wage compensation impacts on labor productivity? Can I find a causal relationship between these two factors leading to the persistence of wage inequality? Moreover, can I show that the persistence of wage inequality is a source of macroeconomic fluctuations? This is my specific question. Of course, I'm aware that wage inequality can be explained by other factors. I'm aware that wage inequality can be impacted by international trade, or there is some evidence that wage inequality may be the outcome of the way international trade is organized. I know that wage inequality can be explained and is explained in several circumstances by gender differences. I know that wage inequality is explained in several circumstances by heterogeneous skills or qualification of the labor force. I know that, but I don't want to tell another of these existing stories. So using the need to control for other determinants, I will simplify, I will use the need to control for other determinants as a disciplinary device to build my model and to justify why I will simplify it in several dimensions which are not directly related to my main purpose. So that's the best methodological defense that I think that I can provide you for the fact that the model is a closed economy model. So there is no international capital flows, there is no international trade. Of course, I'm fully aware that's a very that this simplifying assumption is not realistic. But again, for my purposes, I'm controlling for channels leading potentially to wage inequality coming from these channels related to an open economy. The model doesn't feature government activities. But of course, I know that the government may be a source of wage inequality or may conduct policies leading to or contributing to the persistence of wage inequality. But I don't want to tell another story along those lines. Another simplifying assumption, the economy produces only one good, which can be used for consumption and investment purposes. Of course, we have wage inequality coming from firms producing different goods. But again, I don't want to tell another story like that. Production is conducted by imperfectly competitive firms that use capital and labor using the same technology, and combining in this technology homogeneous labor and homogeneous capital. I'm aware that one popular explanation for wage inequality is the so-called skill-biased technological change. And people like Autor, Acemoglu have been advancing this type of explanation. So technology especially for it being skewed, biased, has been argued and sometimes shown empirically to lead to wage inequality. But I don't want to tell another variant of that story. We know that heterogeneity in skills across workers may be a source of wage inequality. But I don't want to tell another story along that line. So controlling for skill differences, can I still provide a reasonable explanation for wage inequality? That's why firms use the same technology, combine homogeneous labor and homogeneous capital. So let me emphasize again this point, because I think it's important. There is some miscomprehension or misunderstanding regarding the effectiveness of building a model, which is in part related to the alleged irrealism of some assumptions. This misunderstanding, I think, this is a much more complex issue, of course, but this misunderstanding is very often due to the lack of appreciation of what's the purpose of the model. The idea here is not to provide an universal explanation for wage inequality. The simple purpose here is to provide one possible explanation related to firm behavior, to heterogeneous firm behavior in one dimension. And that's why controlling for other potential factors, I can justify this set of simplifying assumptions. So again, of course, I'm aware that technological differences may be a potential explanation for wage inequality. Of course I am. I'm aware of that. Don't blame me for not knowing it. I know it. But I don't want to tell a story like that. I want to do some prospection regarding other possible explanation, which may be, and it's very likely not to be the only one, but it may be found to be present in some situations. Firms are heterogeneous in not only in how they compensate workers, either with a lower or higher wage, but they are also heterogeneous regarding the capital stock that they have. The capital stock is homogeneous, but the amount of capital stock with which each firm is endowed, it's heterogeneous. And capacity utilization is also used across firms. The model is cast in real terms. What that means is that specify the variables, not decomposing them in their nominal and real values. So there is no inflation in the model in that sense. I focus on the real side of the variables, let's say. Again, inflation may be a source of wage inequality. Yes, it may be a source. So why don't you have inflation? Because I don't want to tell another story of inflation leading to wage inequality. That's simple. So there are two wage levels. WL, which stands for the lower wage, and W8, which stands for the higher wage. So let me make another caveat here. Is it reasonable to discuss wage inequality with only 2 wage levels? Of course, it's not reasonable for any purpose. And for most purposes, this is too simplifying an assumption. Under some conditions, which I will not discuss because they involve, let's say, some statistical properties that I don't want to go into here. Under some conditions, these 2 wage levels can be conceived of as 2 average of a broader number or measure of wage levels under some conditions. What matters for my purpose is that some wages are higher than other wages, and firms can choose between these 2 levels. The model would become much more complex if I had 3 or 4 wage levels. Another variable which is important is lambda. Lambda is the variable measuring the composition of the firms. In the following sense, lambda is the proportion of firms. Lambda can be 0 or 1 or some value in between. So lambda is the proportion of firms which compensate workers with the higher wage. And so 1 minus lambda is the proportion of firms which compensate workers with the lower wage. Some definitions, and I promise that that will be the last slide. Let me see if I'm not lying. This is the last slide in which you will see, let's say, mathematical expressions, which look ugly, I know, but they are important for the argument. Some definitions. We have different measures. Well, wage inequality can be measured in different ways, as you know, or may guess. For our purposes, first, there is what we define as the benchmark average wage, which is this weighted average between the higher wage and the lower wage, where the weights are given by the proportion lambda and 1 minus lambda of firms which pay the higher or the lower wage. This is what we call the benchmark average wage. Of course, it will change over time, because even if the wages are constant in real terms, the weights will change through some evolutionary dynamics. Then there is what we call the relative wage differential. The relative wage differential is the ratio of the higher wage to the benchmark average wage. Omega is what we call absolute wage differential, which is simply the ratio of the higher to the lower wage. So we can express the relative wage differential as the absolute wage differential, omega, to the exponent given by 1 minus lambda. Now, why would a firm ever decide to pay the higher wage if it's also possible to pay the lower wage and workers will have to accept? Because there is a, let's say, this is an economy in which the supply of labor is sufficiently elastic. So workers receive a take it or leave it offer, and they will accept even the lower wage if they are not offered the higher one. So labor is always in excess supply in this, let's say, Lewis type of economy. So why would a firm pay a higher wage? Because paying a higher wage is a way of having employed workers performing on the job with a higher productivity. Or using a different parlance, let's say, as we use in another model, paying a higher wage is a mechanism to extract more labor from labor power, if I wanted to phrase it in a Marxian way, let's say. And the arguments would be, and the arguments is isomorphic, let's say. So why would a firm to pay a higher wage? Because paying a higher wage allows the firm to have workers having higher productivity. How much higher? That's where the labor productivity differential function comes in. So alpha is the productivity differential. The subscript H stands for higher wage, or firms paying the higher wage. And the subscript L stands for the firm paying the lower wage. So A is the labor productivity in higher wage firms. AL is labor productivity in firms paying the lower wage. So alpha is the productivity differential, which is greater than 1, based on the empirical evidence that firms paying the higher wage have access to labor having higher productivity. But how much higher? How much higher than 1 depends positively on the relative wage differential, for reasons that I will describe in a while. So the labor productivity differential varies positively with the relative wage differential. That's why this first derivative is strictly positive, for reasons that I will provide in a while, so hold on. But what's important, and I will come back to this in a while, is this marginal effect. Remember, lambda is the proportion of firms which pay the higher wage. But note that the labor productivity differential varies negatively with lambda, which means that the more firms, the higher the proportion of firms paying the higher wage in the expectation of extracting more labor from labor power, let's put that way, the less each of them succeed, for reasons that I will describe in a while. In our model, we provide an explicit functional form for this labor productivity differential function, which is this one, for which this impact is also positive and this is negative. This is just a specific form that we needed, especially for the simulations. As you can see, but this is not crucial, the elasticity of the labor productivity differential with respect to the relative wage differential is unitary. Now, as I said, but it's worth overemphasizing this methodological issue. As in any modeling exercise, we abstract from several other determinants of labor productivity. Of course, I'm fully aware that labor productivity is not affected only by wage compensation. Of course, I'm aware that there are several other determinants of labor productivity which go beyond the wage compensation. I'm fully aware of that. But again, I'm confining attention to this specific channel, first, because there is empirical support to it, not as an universal law, but there is empirical support for it. And second, because that's my specific purpose. So I don't want to be blunt on this, but of course, you can come to me for the next half an hour pointing out other determinants of productivity. Of course. But the story, the explanation, the possible explanation I'm willing to offer you is based on one specific determinant. So any model, any modeling exercise has to do this. As you know, there is this very, as I hope all of you know, there is this famous Argentinian writer, Jorge Luis Borges, who correctly said that a map in the scale or a model which explains everything is as useful as a map in a one-to-one scale. So it's if I want to go from here to Campinas, I don't need a map in a one-to-one scale. So a much larger scale will do. So I don't have to know the details of the landscape. I just have to know how to get to Campinas, from São Paulo to Campinas, where Carol is now, and some of you, I think. So that's why I also abstract from several other channels and mechanisms with which labor productivity varies positively with the wage compensation. So I like this analogy. I'm sure that some of you, if not most of you, when you attend a presentation, a seminar, a lecture, in which someone is presenting econometric results, at some point, you raise this question. Well, this guy is not controlling for this other influence. So if you ask the econometrician to control for other covariates, you should be sympathetic to my controlling for other factors in the context of this model. So that's my best methodological defense for why I simplify the model in several dimensions, to confine attention to the mechanisms that most interest me. So why do we have this marginal effect here? That's important for the results, which means the higher the proportion of firms which pay the higher wage, the less productivity differential they obtain. The reason, for those of you who are familiar with this term, when you have interaction between agents, in situations where the decision of one agent has implications for the outcomes of the decision of other agents, these two decisions may be strategic substitutes or complements. When two decisions are strategic complements, when me, by doing something, increase the payoff of you doing the same thing. So they are strategic complements. So the more I do something, the more profitable or interesting is for you to do the same. But here, note that a decision by one firm to pay the higher wage is characterized by strategic substitutability, which means that when one firm decides to pay the higher wage, this will reduce the gain in terms of productivity differential that all the firms which pay the higher wage will obtain. And the intuition is simple. Since the labor productivity differential varies positively with the relative wage differential, and the relative wage differential declines with the proportion of firms which pay the higher wage, so the more firms pay the higher wage, the less the higher wage will be above the average. That's the reason. So ironically, as we phrase it in a different paper, more leaning, let's say, to a Marxian audience, the more firms try to extract more labor from labor power by paying the higher wage, the less each of them succeed in doing so, which seems to be a contradiction of a market economy. But the idea, again, is simple. If paying above the average is what leads workers to be more willing to deliver more productivity, the more firms will pay the higher wage, the less the difference will be, and the lower will be the productivity differential.
Giba.
Now, yes, Carol.
Can I have a clarifying question?
More than one.
Okay. No, it's just, so you are, for the labor productivity, so you are considering that the firm, when they choose, the labor already has their own productivity, no? It's not that if the firm pays a higher wage, then the workers will improve their productivity, like a wage efficiency, for example.
No, it's
they already have their own productivity.
No, it's an efficiency wage type of argument.
Okay.
Pay me more and I will deliver more effort.
Okay, now I got it. Okay.
So workers are homogeneous, skill-wise. But despite workers are homogeneous, those who are lucky enough or not to be paid the higher wage will deliver more productivity. But again, let's say, we don't phrase this issue in Marxian terms, as we do in a related paper that I can talk about it later. But of course, this has to do, this being paid the higher wage may, in the end, having a higher rate of exploitation. Or the rate of surplus value, let's say, may be higher in firms which pay the higher wage. Of course, if the more I receive, the more productive I am. But the extent to which I'm more productive is greater than of the pay. The unit cost of labor for the firm will be lower. And that's the whole, that's the point of this game. Firms paying the higher wage are placing the following bet. Let's say, let's using a game theory parlance. Firms paying the higher wage are betting on the prospect of having workers being so much more productive that the unit labor cost will be lower. And the unit profit or the profit share will be higher. But that bet may not be successful because there is this strategic substitutability. Firms decide in an uncoordinated way. They don't take into account this externality. Or some of you, let me make another connection. Actually, this connection we do in this paper. Several of you, I'm sure, or hope, are familiar enough with Kalecki's macro theory. In one famous paper discussing the contributions of Tugan Baranovsky and Rosa Luxemburgo, Kalecki says, criticizing Tugan Baranovsky, well, capitalists may do lots of things as class, but they don't invest as class. I hope you will remember this passage. The analogy here that we use, paraphrasing Kalecki's aphorism or claim, is that here firms, they don't decide which wage to pay as a class. So they don't take into account this effect. But it's not a natural attribute. Pay me more, I will deliver higher productivity. In line, in keeping, in accordance with the empirical evidence, or some of it at least. But let me speed up a little bit just to finish. Reasons for that specification. This one, that the labor productivity differential varies positively with the relative wage differential. First, the benchmark average wage is conventionally seen by employed workers as a reliable measure of her outside wage option. So that's an argument. Another argument is that the reference point represented by the benchmark average wage is conventionally seen by a worker as a reliable estimate of her wage expectation under uncertainty. And we have survey evidence showing that below deviations from reference wages are perceived as negatively affecting worker morale. We also have econometric evidence that efforts depends on a worker's pay relative to the reference point, which is determined by wage expectation. We also have experimental evidence that increased wage expectation can act as a reference point, positively affecting workers' performance on the job. But that's a graphical representation. Alpha, let me remind you, is the labor productivity differential. Lambda is the proportion of firms which pay the higher wage. Since there is this strategic substitutability in the paying of the higher wage, the more firms, the higher the proportion of firms paying the higher wage, which means the higher lambda, the lower the labor productivity differential. Now, how does the macro part of the model works? We divide time in 3 spans, what we call the ultra short run, the short run, and the long run. And in a Marshallian way, these runs are defined depending on what variables are given and what variables are determined in each run. In the ultra short run, the functional distribution is determined because firms have already decided what strategy, what wage compensation strategy they will play. Given the functional distribution of income, in the short run, aggregate effective demand will determine the macro variables, capacity utilization and output growth. And towards the long run, the proportion of firms which choose one or the other wage compensation, one or the other compensation strategy will change. Now, let me briefly, very briefly, explain this part of the macro side. The macro model is a demand-led model. So firms will operate with excess capacity. They will produce as much for which there is effective demand. So we have to specify an investment function which is independent from savings, because it's investment determining savings, not the other way around, because it's a demand-led model. It's a demand-led model of the, let's say, of the Cambridge, UK type, which means that the functional distribution of income impacts on effective demand, under the assumption that while workers spend on consumption all their wage income, capitalists, who are the owners of the firms, they receive profit income and they save part of it. So you have this differential saving propensity, which means that any income transfer from profits to wages will raise consumption and may or may not raise investment depending on the specification of the investment function. We specify the investment function in a way which will lead to what the literature will call wage-led demand, which means that any income transfer from profits to wages leads to a rise in aggregate effective demand and therefore raises capacity utilization and output growth. So in the language of this modeling, the system works in the macro side as a wage-led model. But the functional distribution of income, as I said, will depend on the dynamics of the microdiversity, because the dynamics of the microdiversity will determine the average markup of the firms. And the average markup of the firms will determine the average profit share in the economy. So the microdiversity will change over time. This will change the functional distribution of income, and that will change the degree of capacity utilization and output growth. But remember, there is this strategic substitutability in the paying of the higher wage. Paying a higher wage may or may not lead to a productivity gain, which leads to a lower unit cost, and therefore to a higher unit profit or profit share. So pi is the average profit share, and the bar over the pi means the average across firms. So because there is this strategic substitutability, if the proportion of firms which pay the higher wage is low, a higher proportion of them doing so raises the profit share and lowers capacity utilization and growth. But above some threshold, if more firms pay the higher wage, the average profit share will fall, and the level of capacity utilization and output growth will rise. So the demand regime in the model depends on microdiversity. This is another contribution, because usually this type of macro models, they don't have this decomposition. Here, we can have a regime change, a aggregate demand regime change due to microdiversity changing over time. So it's an endogenous demand regime change, which is absent in models of this type. Let me approach the conclusion telling you how the microdiversity evolves over time. By microdiversity, I mean the heterogeneity in firms' decision about how to compensate workers. Here, we will use the notion of satisficing by Simon. I hope several of you will be familiar with this contribution by Simon, which is, let's say, unlike several people in conventional economic theory believe, let's say, the father of the notion of bounded rationality is not Thomas Sargent, who wrote a book called Bounded Rationality. But actually the father, well, this is always a tricky exercise. Who was the father of something in the history of economic thought? But let me put this way. Simon talked about bounded rationality much earlier than Tom Sargent. But one of the most insightful contributions by Simon is the notion of satisficing, in opposition to the notion of optimizing. So due to limitations in collecting and processing information, people have to rely on satisficing behavior and not in an optimizing behavior. So what that means is people, instead of looking for an optimal solution, they look for a satisficing solution. Satisficing in the following sense. Satisficing in the sense of meeting some acceptability threshold. Maybe I love this way of putting it by Simon. The contrast between satisficing and optimizing is analogous to looking for the sharpest needle in the haystack, which is optimizing. Satisficing means looking for a needle sharp enough to see with. And also, again, there is empirical evidence, empirical and experimental evidence by this notion, by this notion of satisficing. So how does we implement this? This is a heavy part of the paper. Let me explain the intuition to you. It's a heavy part because it involves some statistical things like random variables and things like that. So the idea is the following. Each firm has what we call a satisficing profit rate. This satisficing profit rate is randomly and independently determined across firms and over time. Each firm has a satisficing rate of profit, but the actual rate of profit that the firm will have will depend on their actual operations, which depends on the markup they will set and how much they will sell. Because you will remember, firms have different capital stocks. The aggregate effective demand will be randomly distributed across firms. So that's why the degree of capacity utilization will be heterogeneous across firms. But firms have a satisficing rate of profit or a satisficing markup in the end. But the actual markup will be the outcome of their interaction with other firms. So in the end, they may succeed or not in the bet they place of paying the higher wage. If a given firm happens to have an actual rate of profits lower than the satisficing one, the firm will switch strategy. If the actual rate of profit is at least as high as the satisficing one, the firm will keep playing the same compensation strategy. That's the logic. That's the logic. So it's an evolutionary game in which firms play each other. We have a large population of firms making uncoordinated pricing and wage compensation decisions, and how they will succeed in terms of achieving a rate of profit which is at least as high as the satisficing one depends on the interaction between them. That's why it's a population dynamics. Look, it's let me apologize for, I forgot to apologize for missing my presentation on Wednesday. Carolina told you, I think, look, I got the virus. Everybody here in my house got it, but luckily it was a very light one. So the symptoms were very light. But I don't know how did I get it, because I was being very careful. But it's a population dynamics. No matter how careful you are individually, by interaction, you may get it. So when you have this type of interaction, you have unintended consequences, which doesn't depend on your own individual decision making. So that's the game here. That's why it's a population game. That's why it's a population dynamic. Firms are interacting to each other in this complex way. Now, what's an equilibrium in this game? An equilibrium is in this game is a situation where the proportion of firms playing each strategy is constant. So the composition of the population is constant. But let me clarify from the outset one very important thing. When we say that the composition of the population of firms is constant, that doesn't mean at all that firms are not switching strategy. The composition is constant. It's like when the composition of the population in terms of infected people is constant. The population of some country, let's say India, Pakistan, the proportion of infected people may be constant, but that doesn't mean that you don't have people get infected. That doesn't mean that you don't have people not being infected anymore. So you can have lots of action. The proportion, the composition is constant, but you can have lots of action. Some people are getting infected, some other people are getting out of the infection, but the proportion of infected people is constant. So equilibrium here, please, don't do this, or don't do close enough to me because I will disagree. That doesn't mean that the system, that nothing is happening. Of course, lots of things are happening, but the variable measuring this composition effect is constant. So where does the system go over time? That's what we call evolutionary equilibrium. We can have what we call monomorphic equilibrium. Monomorphic is almost self-explanatory. Monomorphic means an unique form. So in evolutionary biology, that's a situation in which only one species or strategy or phenotype survive. So one single form survive. So we can have these two monomorphic evolutionary equilibria in which either all firms pay the higher wage or all firms pay the lower wage. These two equilibria are shown to be unstable, which means that unless the economy starts there, it will not converge to that point, which has empirical support, because the whole point of the exercise is to show that persistent wage inequality may emerge as an endogenous outcome. So luckily, we are able to find what we call polymorphic evolutionary equilibria or equilibrium. Polymorphic means more than one form, more than one species, more than one phenotype will survive. So these two firms will survive. If you have this coexistence of firms paying the higher and the lower wage, you have wage inequality. And we show that for this satisficing evolutionary dynamic, the polymorphic evolutionary equilibrium is unique and is stable. So it's in this formal sense that we show that wage inequality is a persistent outcome, is an outcome of heterogeneous behavior on the part of firms, is the outcome of microdiversity being heterogeneous, persistently heterogeneous. Finally, Carol. Finally, we show through simulation, we show through simulation that a reasonably low level of wage inequality is able to lead the system to experience self-sustaining, endogenously created fluctuations in the macroeconomic variables of interest, capacity utilization, and output growth, and also the functional distribution of income. We do this, I don't want to scare you, despite some of you may like it, but for doing so, we use a formal technique in dynamic systems called bifurcation analysis. So wage inequality, the wage differential is a bifurcation parameter. Bifurcation intuitively means that when that parameter crosses some value, some bifurcation value, the stability properties will change. Either new equilibria will arise, or an equilibrium which was stable loses the stability. So we do this through simulation. Here at the top, we have lambda, which is the proportion of firms paying the higher wage in the vertical axis, and in the horizontal axis, hopefully you can read it, but I think that Camila has already circulated the slides. Here in the horizontal axis, we have omega. You will recall, omega is the absolute wage differential, the higher to the lower wage, which is higher than 1. What this top panel shows is that as the size of the wage differential measured by the ratio of the higher wage to the lower wage rises, first you have one equilibrium, but then the equilibrium, when the wage inequality is only 1.09, which means that the higher wage is only 90% higher than the lower wage, you have this bifurcation. You have two equilibria. When the wage inequality is slightly higher, 13%, each equilibria will split into two. If inequality is slightly higher, 13.5%, each of the previous 4 equilibria will split in two. That's why this type of bifurcation is called flip or period doubling bifurcation. The equilibria doubles. This very complicated area here, this is what's most interesting for us, because it's a situation where the dynamics of the variables will be chaotic, deterministically chaotic, which is, let's say, in a very simplified way, is a technical definition for irregular, aperiodic fluctuations. So it's chaotic, not in the sense that there is no order. It's chaotic in the sense that the dynamics is irregular, aperiodic. There is no clear pattern. That's the most simplified way of putting it. And we have these irregular fluctuations for low levels, for a very slow level of the wage differential, which is 1.16, which means that the higher wage or the higher wage is only 16% higher than the lower wage. Or on average, the higher wage is 16% higher than the lower wage, which is a very reasonable value for, which is in accordance with the empirical evidence. So in this case, we are in this chaotic range. So the microdiversity will fluctuate irregularly, and therefore the macroeconomic, the functional distribution of income, capacity utilization, and output growth will also fluctuate irregularly over time. So here we have in the top panel, as you can see, for that region, one specific point in that chaotic region, see how the microdiversity, here we have lambda, now we have time in the horizontal axis. See how the microdiversity changes over time irregularly, which means that the wage differential varies over time irregularly. And the same applies to the average profit share and the average capacity utilization. So let me conclude with this. Take a look in this panel, this down panel. Here we have what? The behavioral capacity utilization over time for a reasonably low level of a wage inequality. As you can see, capacity utilization fluctuates persistently. And more than that, it fluctuates irregularly, aperiodically, erratically, or chaotically. Take a look at this panel. Let me show you. Let me show you just conclude this graph. What we have here, this is data for the US compiled by the Fed in St. Louis, capacity utilization. A long series from the early 60s till last month or 2 months ago. Look at the pattern. Endogenous fluctuations, erratically, irregularly, chaotically. Of course, I'm not claiming that we are replicating exactly, quantitatively speaking, that pattern. But the argument is qualitative. we are able to replicate, we are able to provide a coupled explanation for the persistence of wage inequality, a persistence which varies over time in an irregular way, and it's a potential explanation for this type of macro behavior. That's all I will claim. All I will claim. I'm happy to have providers. Of course, happiness is a very personal issue. But I'm happy to have first told a theoretically reasonable, robust story based on evolutionary biology for wage inequality, for its persistence and endogenously time-varying behavior over time, and as a potential source of macroeconomic instability, macroeconomic fluctuations. That's all I will claim. Of course, there are several explanations for this behavior, for why the economy fluctuates over time. And this is probably the key question in macro. No? Why does the economy fluctuate without exploding? But what does explain these fluctuations? Of course, there are several explanations, and probably a combination, maybe a convex combination of some of them provides the best explanation. Modestly, what we do in this paper is to provide one candidate, another candidate, which may or may not prove empirically to be capable of providing even a slight explanation. But again, I'm from a time and from a perspective in which we test empirically things for which we have some theoretical support. So maybe this explanation doesn't play a role or will not be found to play a role in some empirical testing. All I can assure you is that it's an implication which is theoretically robust. Whether it's empirically relevant is for others who are more prepared, more willing to, more qualified, have more time, have more, let's say, more interest in the empirical test than my co-author and I. So again, sorry, Carol. As usual, I was completely well-behaved with respect to the timekeeping. But if you don't stop me, I will keep talking forever, as you know. Anyway, but remember, don't throw out the baby with the dirt water if you don't like the model. What's promising here is the evolutionary approach to inequality. But evolutionary, not in the, let's say, in the negative sense, which is usually a vulgarization of Darwin, that inequality is the natural outcome of the survival of the fittest. That's not the message, please. I'm claiming for an evolutionary addressing of inequality problems, not as a way of using some interpretation of some evolutionary contributions, some interpretation of Darwin to claim that, sorry, inequality is the inevitable outcome of the fittest doing better than the less fitted. That's not the point. The evolutionary dimension is in microdiversity resulting from agents, in this case, firms, switching behavior and looking for the behavior which is better for them. But the problem is firms looking for what's better for them create persistent wage inequality. That's the bottom line. The idea is to show exactly that a system in which firms are allowed to look for what better suits their purposes may lead to wage inequality and macroeconomic fluctuations. That's the evolutionary implication I would like to draw. Not that inequality is the inevitable outcome of the fittest surviving more effectively than the less fitted. That's not my evolutionary take on this. I will stop. Finally.
Thanks, Giba, for the great presentation. I think we can open with, we still have a bit of time. So if the students have doubts, comments, questions, you can ask.
Disagreements.
Yeah, you can raise your hand or write in the chat as well. Do you see the chat, Giba? No, because you have the presentation open.
No, yes, I can see.
You see. Okay. So I think the students can use the raise hand button, or Lilian.
Well, hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I have two questions. One is a clarifying one, and the other one is more on the implications. The first one is just to confirm whether I understood correctly. One of the assumptions, since there is no inflation, is it also that firms sell the goods at the same price? Yep. Okay. And then my question is, with respect to the profit share and the profit rate, I guess there would also be a distribution in terms of profits from the model structure, right? And I was wondering whether if you measured that, and also if I was just thinking that it should be smaller than the distribution of wages. Is there a relationship between the distribution of wages? So should it always be smaller than that of wages, or should it be higher? Is there a pattern? And that's it. Thank you.
Regarding the first question, Lila, yeah, we freeze the price level because I could not go into this detail, but let me just clarify briefly. So take a firm which pays the higher wage. It will have access to labor having a higher productivity. So in principle, that firm could do different things with the productivity differential. It could charge the same price and charge a higher markup. It could charge the same markup and a lower price, or it could do a combination of the two. The reason why we decide that they will all charge the same price and we will adjust the markup is precisely to freeze the price level and not to have inflation effects and only distribution effects, because we wanted to focus on distribution. So related to your second question, that means that firms will have different markups. So there will be a distribution of markups, because firms can play two different strategies regarding what wage to pay. All firms which pay the higher wage have access to the same productivity, but they have a distribution of markups across them, which may or may not be larger than the inequality in the wages. We don't measure, even in the simulation, that's something interesting for us to do. We don't do that, but we could measure inequality in terms of markups of the firms, or to have a measure of profit inequality across firms, which I guess, since we have more dispersion across firms in terms of markups, it's very likely that for reasonable values of the parameters and initial conditions, for these that we use to run these simulations, inequality across firms in terms of unit profits is probably larger than wage inequality. But to some extent, Lilian, that's by construction. That's by construction. Because we had to give enough dispersion in the satisficing markup by each firm for the satisficing protocol to work. Because that part is very complex, because we have to give a distribution of satisficing profit rate, which is equivalent to a distribution of satisficing markup across firms. And then we match in terms using some statistic techniques, what's the probability of a firm which is randomly drawn from the population to have an actual markup which is higher or lower than the satisficing one. So we have to have enough dispersion for the satisficing protocol to work. And that's why, by construction, there is more heterogeneity in markups, and therefore larger inequality by the Gini coefficient or the Tile coefficient. We didn't calculate that, but we could. That is higher. If we calculate the Gini coefficient for the markups, it's very likely to be considerably higher than for the wages. But that's mostly by construction, because in order to use, just a last comment, not to go whatever again, we use several techniques which require that we have a sufficiently large population of firms. So for instance, for us to calculate the expected value of a given variable and proxy it by the probability, the population has to be large enough. So that's why we had to assume a large population of firms and large enough dispersion of firms. So that's why by construction, there is larger inequality across firms in terms of profitability than inequality across workers. But that's mostly by construction.
Okay, thank you.
Giba, I think the time is almost over. I had some clarifying questions. I don't know if you have some minutes more, or you prefer.
No, I'm surviving.
Yes.
Evolutionary survival.
Okay. It might be very.
The coronavirus.
You can. Okay. They're very simple. It's just for me to understand better the idea. So this idea of satisficing profit rate that the firm would keep, for example, their strategy, is more or less a expected profit rate, no? That guarantee them to keep the strategy, no? Otherwise they change. So
yeah, it's not. It's let's see. It's the desired.
Desire more than expect.
Of course, they expect to get what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the evolutionary feature to this interaction. Firms have a desired profitability, about which we don't say much, other than to simply assume that there is a distribution of satisfying levels of profitability. Because this type of population dynamics, it's what we call mean field. It's a kind of mean field approach. We have this distribution of desired profitability, which means desired markups, and firms, an individual firm, of course, will make decisions intending to achieve what they desire. Of course, if these were a world in which firms have full information, firms have full knowledge of the working of the economy, if firms have the ability to form rational expectations, they would all make decisions in a way which would be confirmed by the outcomes of the model.
Yeah, it would guarantee them.
But here they have imperfect information, bounded rationality. They know they are unable to optimize. So what they do is they try by trial and error, adaptively, they try to reach their desired profitability. But the drama, let's put this way, because it's quite a drama, like in a market economy. The drama is how much they will succeed in achieving their desired profitability by making uncoordinated decisions regarding how to compensate workers, how much to charge, how much to sell, will depend on what other firms will be doing.
Yeah.
So in a, let's say, some more let's say, some true believers in agent-based modeling will probably complain about this abuse of language. But what will come out is an emergent property. So the macrodynamics is an emergent property of a myriad of agents, firms, making decisions, trying to do their best under imperfect information, under bounded rationality. Of course, they will try to do their best, but how much they will actually succeed in achieving what they desire depends on a complex web of interactions within which they are embedded. That's the drama. That's the drama.
Yeah, because then it goes to my second doubt, Giba. That's because you said that the equilibrium is a constant proportion of firms, no? So in this sense, if you have multiple equilibria, this means that in each one you have different proportion of firms, no? And then, so in this sense, because I think this result that you have, for example, the capacity utilization fluctuation that is real, no? In this sense, the results of your model supports the idea that there is no convergence, no, for a normal capacity utilization, or not?
No, yes.
As
firms,
some theorists no suppose.
No, it's on even if the average capacity utilization, is found to be constant, even if it were found to be constant, even if it were found to be constant, that on average, there is no notion of any normal or desired capacity utilization by each firm being achieved. So that's you may have in the aggregate the average being constant. And I can assure you, for some very reasonable parametrizations, the average capacity utilization may be found to be constant, as is usually the case. Because you take this whole controversy regarding capacity utilization. So people argue correctly, on average, there is no long-run trend. The average has no long-run trend. But that doesn't mean that the reason why that's so is because firms have achieved their desired or normal level. That's among other problems, as you know, that I find in this approach. But all these approaches, insisting on some normal level of utilization, sidestep what seems to be a crucial evidence. Firms may have some desire. I'm not disputing that firms may have a desired rate of capacity utilization. I'm not disputing it. What I'm disputing is that it's homogeneous across firms. Because it's not homogeneous across firms. It's an unreasonable assumption. But it's possible to reconcile a constant average capacity utilization, a trendless capacity utilization in the long run in this evolutionary framework without relying on a representative firm type of argument, as in the for instance, in the super multiplier. But here, firms on average have, let's say, a constant capacity utilization. But that doesn't mean that each one of them is operating at some mythical normal level. That's not how the world works, or at least not the world in which I live, or at least in the world as I see it.
Yeah, it's closer to Kalecki idea, no, Gil?
Of course. But the problem, Carol, now that you push me to this line of thought, that's the problem that most heterodox macro has been facing for quite a while. We have some intuition regarding individual behavior, leading to some macro outcomes, which are correct. But the way we have to formalize macro closes the door for us to implement that intuition. So take, for instance, let me give you a simple but a very telling example, because this is something that I'm trying to do for a while. Take Keynes' argument in chapter 3 of the general theory on the principle of effective demand. The intuition is quite reasonable. A market economy subjects an individual firm to an inescapable uncertainty. Am I able to sell as many output as I produce? This is the key intuition, I think. But then the way Keynes has to explain it in chapter 3 of the general theory is plagued, I think, with lots of imprecisions, because he has to describe a mechanism which involves interaction across heterogeneous firms using the figure of the representative firm. So it's a long struggle to derive a macro outcome without explicitly dealing with interaction between heterogeneous agents. But that's how far he could get with his Marshallian formation and background. That's why I don't show it here, because, but the other paper on wage inequality that I circulated, the one in Metroeconomica, is disappointing for the Kaleckians like me in the following sense. We have this standard result in Kaleckian macroeconomics. If you transfer income from profits to wages, capacity utilization rises and output growth rises. We have this macro model. When you disaggregate that model, it's possible to show that under some conditions, the higher the proportion of firms which pay higher wages, instead of leading to the Kaleckian outcome, which would be the intuition, leads to the opposite. So once composition effects once heterogeneity across firms are properly taken into account, some results which hold in a macro representative agent model don't hold anymore. So some macro results which are canonical are not robust to some decompositions. So that's why we have to do, I have several models using the representative firm, the representative agent, the representative worker, the representative firm, and they are useful, but we cannot rely on them only. Composition effects do matter a lot, and they may lead to the not holding of some standard macro outcomes. And we have to open that box, even if it's a Pandora box. Even if it's a Pandora box. We cannot skill opening that boxes. Or I don't skill, which is, of course, doesn't help much my popularity in some quarters. But okay, that's fine. That's life.
And Giba, there is just one last question in the chat from Tatiana.
I can read it.
Yeah.
Let's see. Can we say that evolutionary? Exactly. That's part of the same perception. That's part of the same perception. Simon, one common thread across all his contributions is how in some way, interaction, even in an artificial setting, may coordinate in order to yield some stable outcome. So it's the same. So it's the same Simon. It's the same Simon. It's a metaphor, but I think that it's a metaphor. Let me say this first. I'm pushing Simon towards an evolutionary approach, probably more than he would feel comfortable with. I'm aware of that. But I think it's reasonable to do so. I think it's reasonable to do so. So even if I agree with you that that's the metaphor, one could claim correctly that I'm probably in this paper pushing that metaphor too far or farther than Simon himself would agree, which is fine, We don't have to be, we have to be respectful to him, but we may, let's say, we have the license to try to extend. But sure, that's for sure. Which is a nice book, The Sciences of the Artificial.